So the Delta Quadrant is just a bunch of dicks, isn't it?
Well, yeah. I mean, we see that in the next episode as well. That's kind of the point of the entire episode. So yes,
this has been we've talked a little bit about this, and now they're actually making the subtext text in a way. Every single species they've come across has just double-crossed them or revealed themselves to be evil, or I think we said the Vidians are the only people who have come to them at face value, and they were assholes from the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, the Vidians were basically jerks, and they were telling you that they were jerks and kind of evil. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's really right, and I wonder about what that is saying. Like, I don't know if that's a point of view that the show is calculatedly making, or if it's just kind of happening. And I'm not sure what the answer is. I kind of think it's probably just kind of happening, and they're leaning into it.
Yeah, the second episode, Alliances in particular, does feel like they noticed it. They looked at what they've done so far at this, because now we're about a season and a half in. Certainly they've written a full season and produced a full season by the time this is being written. And yeah, it does look like they looked at what they had and they said, wow, they're a bunch of jerks. Like, this is a really lawless place. Well, it's funny how these, I don't know, just, this is very kind of crazy, but this is presaging just the asshole part of the internet in a lot of ways. I mean, they are in a place where there is, as they say in Alliances, and that's certainly the meteor of the two episodes, we're in a very lawless place. You know, nobody is following any standards. Like, I don't know. It obviously wasn't quite commenting on that. This was a little before even the internet of the 90s, and I'm being kind of facetious, but they can no longer count on other people to have laws, or I don't know, it's very savage in its way. I'm worried that this is coming off as we are the only people who have civilization, and we're trying to bring that to the Delta Quadrant, or we're trying to at least survive in a place without the standards of the Federation. I don't know if that's a problem or not, because I know DS9 did very well to say, how do you have a certain standard of morality when the people around you aren't, when you are facing conflicts to which you can't just play nicey nice at all and get through. What do you do when you need to show a strength, when you need to have a show of strength without going against what you believe in? And
well, I mean, I think that's an interesting question, especially in light of both of these episodes, Prototype and Alliances, this week, because I don't know, there's two things going on here. I think the first thing, of course, is that we are talking about a television show. We're talking about drama, and so they need protagonists, and protagonists need antagonists. So in a sense, kind of everybody that Voyager is meeting so far are dicks because they need some sort of antagonist, and that is, I'm trying to be charitable. I think that it may just be that the people writing for the show are not as well versed in the idea of creating interesting antagonists that aren't just jerks, if you know what I mean. And that's kind of part of it. I think the other part of that, of course, is that Alliances leans very heavily into this idea that the Delta Quadrant is a portion of space without rules, I think, as Janeway puts it. And if you think about what the environment of Star Trek has been for the past 30 years before Star Trek Voyager was created and aired, it primarily takes place in the Alpha Quadrant. It takes place in a region of space that is filled with antagonistic alien species that really, without the Federation, does the Alpha Quadrant look like the Delta Quadrant? I don't know if we can answer that question, but it seems like maybe the answer is yes.
Well, part of the implication is that the Kazon certainly are a new power, right? Their society has rebooted in the past, I think, 30 years, they said. So at least this region of the Delta Quadrant has gone through a lot of upheavals, and so in some ways, things haven't settled down yet in order for laws and rules to be in place. This is kind of the Wild West, and Janeway is the sheriff who's gonna bring order to this place, while at the same time, not sure if she has the right to put order into this place. I mean, a lot of the talk about the Prime Directive is, can we really make a change to this quadrant where we don't belong, really? They just kind of want to get home. At the same time, again, in Alliances, she sees the opportunity to do some good, and she does feel compelled to take it.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's we're talking a lot about Alliances, which is fine, because I think it's the more, like you said, it's the meatier and the better episode of the pairings this week. But I want to leave that aside for right now and focus on Prototype, because for me, I think there's also some relevance to this episode, because once again, you have this idea. I mean, both of these episodes are Prime Directive episodes. Both of these episodes are really predicated on the concept that there is an alien species out there that needs Voyager's help or would benefit from Voyager's help. And Janeway is very, very clear that she is not going to give them that help. And in both instances, it ends very badly. Prototype perhaps worse than Alliances, but and also the genesis of the problem in Prototype is coming directly out of this idea of the Delta Quadrant as being this more lawless place.
Yeah. Well, I would say both, they are kind of two halves of the same problem. Prototype is dealing with this issue from a lower level, from B'Elanna's perspective. When she comes to the captain with her quandaries, Janeway doesn't really go through any angst. She spends a couple minutes debating the problem, but she's not really confused as to whether that's the right thing. For the decision to not willingly give this technology to the robots is a fairly easy decision from Janeway's point of view, and B'Elanna's the one street level who's dealing with it.
Right.
Alliances then takes the captain's point of view. Again, the captain has said, I am the one who has to ultimately make these kind of decisions. I'm the one best equipped. And in Alliances, we see a lot more of what actually goes into that thought process. So yeah, they are this is a very interesting pairing to have.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, because I think that really Prototype is not interesting to talk about in terms of the actual Prime Directive problem here, because it's dispensed with very quickly, and I think that both of us at this point would agree with Janeway's decision, her interpretation of the Prime Directive. Yeah. No, we are not going to give the robots the ability to procreate. That is not what we are here to do, and that may have consequences that we have no idea what would happen. It spins out of control wildly. What Prototype essentially is, I think, is an episode which is predicated on the idea of showing showing the Maquis broadly, and then B'Elanna Torres more specifically, the value of the Prime Directive, the wisdom of the Prime Directive, and quote unquote the Starfleet way of doing things. And
I have to say, and this is, again, B'Elanna's becoming a much more interesting character because of how she's not happy with the decision that, number one, from just I really like seeing B'Elanna geeking out in the early stages of this episode. She's not sleeping, she's not eating, because she has a problem. She's got to solve it, and she's partially disappointed Janeway says no because, well, this is a problem, and I'm really interested, and I just want to do this. This is fun, and she doesn't get to play with a new toy in a way, but she also does feel a responsibility.
Not to cut you off, but it made me realize something about B'Elanna while you said that, is that she is more Starfleet than, if you think about the engineers, the chief engineers that we have had on our show so far, and I'm leaving Scotty aside out of this because that was just a whole different era of television.
Yeah.
But if you think about Geordi, you think about Miles O'Brien, and you think about B'Elanna Torres, what differentiates Geordi and B'Elanna Torres from Miles O'Brien is that Geordi and B'Elanna Torres are both shown to be careerists. They live for their work. They are really into the idea of their work, and they find their work fun. Whereas Miles O'Brien is again the everyman. He is the work and stick.
Yeah.
He doesn't want to live his job. How does he have fun? He makes models of the Alamo and plays games with his friend in the holosuite. So it's kind of interesting to me that the show is kind of leaning into this idea of quote unquote teaching B'Elanna Torres the Starfleet way, because I think she's kind of equipped for it naturally.
Well, I'm not sure if careerist is quite the word I'd use. That seems more about political and getting ahead to me, but they are, it is true. Miles O'Brien doesn't really work on these personal tech projects. He does from time to time, but and it's not incidental, I would say, that both B'Elanna and Geordi are single. I mean, they don't have family lives.
Yeah.
They don't have family lives to come home to. O'Brien obviously does, and so that's where his priorities are.
Well, in the 7th season, when B'Elanna Torres and the Doctor get married and have holographic children, we can test that theory.
I mean, wouldn't they just be half holographic?
I think that's really offensive.
All right, half human. I mean, I think it's been clear that when B'Elanna was at the Academy, she, in a way, wasn't ready. I get the sense that B'Elanna, again, intellectually may have been obviously able to hold their own. The professor that Janeway knew certainly thought very highly of her abilities, but she was probably just... you get the sense she wasn't old enough to get through the Academy, if you know what I mean.
Sure,
and
yeah.
Her time in the Maquis was what tempered her and what kind of had her grow up a bit, and now that she's on Voyager, she's completed that step. So... yeah, she certainly has always been able to do Starfleet. She just needed a little time to bake.
I think that's right, and I really think that is... I mean, I think that's why she's so... I don't know, it's hard to say, because I think I look at the end of this episode and she realizes to what degree she's made a horrible mistake, and she obviously corrects her mistake. And I don't know, I mean, I feel like this is another step on the journey that B'Elanna Torres is making to really be coming through and through Starfleet.
Yeah. She is... yeah, she just... I mean, in a lot of ways, she just needed the right captain. And she is going... she will be Janeway in 10 years, maybe.
Yeah, it's certainly... well, if they're back in the Alpha Quadrant by then.
But, yeah, that is certainly... and that's probably going to be the kind of captain that she will eventually be, but...
this is a small thing, but I'm really enjoying scenes with Janeway and B'Elanna. I don't know how you're feeling about them, but they don't happen very often, but I can remember each one of them. And I mean, think about an episode like Maneuvers, or way back from the second episode of the series, where they just have this really interesting dynamic that both actresses are playing very well, that it's not necessarily a mentor-mentee relationship. I think it's a little bit too combative for that, and I think Torres is a little bit too old for that. Yeah. But they have a kind of grudging respect for each other, but at the same time, I think it's coming from a different place, because at least I think especially you can see that in the conversation they have surrounding, whether or not to get this robot the ability to procreate. But I think Janeway really appreciates the fact that Torres will argue with her, and Torres really appreciates the fact that Janeway will let her argue with her.
Yeah. I mean, it's not impossible to think of Voyager in a little more family terms, especially when you consider B'Elanna and Janeway, when you consider Harry Kim and Janeway, and when you consider B'Elanna and Harry Kim. I mean, they have kind of a teasing brother-sisterly relationship. It's not impossible to put Janeway as mom in that scenario. Again, not quite maternal either, but I like that the relationship does have resonances in all of these different places. They have they have a very complicated relationship, but it is one that is ultimately very warm and very... here we have another instance of one of Janeway's officers disobeying an order, right? She has been ordered not to create this thing, and Torres decides, because of the extreme situation, it is right to go against this order. This is something that Janeway doesn't really have isn't upset with her at the end. She understands why Torres made that decision, and it's not necessarily a wrong decision in context either. And she understands that B'Elanna has some very complex feelings after this, and I don't know.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's a good point, because one of the things that I think struck me about this episode in particular is the fact that Janeway did not really come down hard on Torres. And I think primarily the reason for that, and this may sound facile, but Torres thought that she was doing something that, if it wasn't good, at least it was kind of morally neutral. Whereas, say Tuvok doing something in the episode Prime Factors, or even Chakotay doing something like in Maneuvers, their actions were a bit more not morally gray. They were a little bit more morally wrong. And so I think Janeway realizes that B'Elanna has learned her lesson and she's not going to come down hard on her because, well, A, she was being held hostage. Let's not forget that. But also because I don't think that Janeway is the type of captain to say, well, you should have committed suicide then. You know what I mean?
No, and the optics of the situation are also very different. I mean, when Janeway is talking to Chakotay at the end of the episode where he gets captured the other week.
Maneuvers.
Yes, at the end of Maneuvers, she specifically says, you're my first officer and you disobeyed a direct order and you just went off and, again, in a way that everybody pretty much agrees is stupid. He should have waited, should have done this as a team with the plan and all of that. Tuvok is such a prominent member of the crew, is her right hand, if not the first officer, and is the chief of security on the ship, and him disobeying a direct order also looks very bad. B'Elanna, who is the chief engineer, yes, a senior officer, but also newly in that position and much junior to Chakotay and Tuvok, making a decision to save the ship doesn't look as bad, frankly. It's not something that is going to cause dissension in the ranks.
Yeah, I think that's right. Now, the other thing to talk about in this episode, of course, is the robot. We haven't talked about the robot at all.
C-3PO.
Right. And I think he prefers to be called 3PO. I think that it's interesting only because it is very aesthetically similar to a 1950s sort of science fiction. I like it. I think it works. I think it works primarily because it's doing something. It's taking the setting of the show. It's taking the setting of the Delta Quadrant, and it is kind of saying, okay, well, we are not in the standard Star Trek milieu anymore. We can do different things with different sorts of technology and not have it seem out of place. I mean, on the one hand, you could say it looks hokey, but I like it. I don't know.
I mean, it is very dehumanizing in a way. I mean, Data is mentioned in this episode, and I want to talk about Data and Spock's mentions at some point. But Data was obviously played by a human actor who is, just wearing some makeup, sure, but
wait. Data wasn't real?
Data wasn't real.
Oh my God.
But no, the makeup on Data was not just a mask. This doesn't even have eyes. And so it looks cutesy and hokey at first, and then I would say later on when it's revealed, they are revealed to be a danger. I mean, that one scene where he goes and they're on the monitor and he goes in front of B'Elanna, and it's really fucking creepy. And I really liked it for that moment because that's it. I don't know. It came off a lot more clever than I initially thought. Again, I laughed when I first saw the robot. Oh, this is cute. He's a little bot. Aw, she's gonna have a robot friend. And now, later in the episode, when they reveal their true intentions, their non-humanness becomes very obvious in a way, which is a strange direction for a Star Trek show to go.
Well, their non-humanness, but I don't think it discounts their personhood. And I also think that that sort of dehumanizing nature of the way that they look without eyes and things like that kind of makes sense for why they were created and who created them. I mean, we don't know a lot about the Kravik, these aliens that created these robots to essentially fight a war for them. But you wouldn't really want them to look too, I'm going to say human only because there's no other word for it, but you wouldn't want them to look too much like yourself because otherwise that is going to start making people have moral objections or moral thoughts about what it is exactly you created these robots to do in the first place.
Which is pretty much the plot of Westworld, yes.
Yeah, it is. That's true. But I don't know that, I mean, that's not really what the point of the episode is, though. And I think that, we could talk about the morality of the Kravik making these robots and robot free will and all this kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, that's not really where the meat of this episode lies.
Yeah, no, it's... They are living weapons in their way, right? They are fighting an eternal war for sides that are extinct, and frankly, they have an expiration date. They won't be destroying the quadrant indefinitely as they would be if they do figure out how to procreate, right? They will.
Yeah.
It may take another few centuries, but they will eventually break down and biodegrade, and then these two cultures that destroyed each other, they will be just lost in the winds.
Yeah. And it really does speak to the very nature of the Prime Directive is talking about evolution, because, I think that there was a mention of evolution in this episode. And on the one hand, you say, well, how could that apply to robots? But it does, right? Because this society is dying naturally. And if you give them the ability to procreate, it is going to make their society evolve, because evolution isn't just about life forms. It's also about society and culture. So, by having this war die out, that is probably the natural course of how things are going. Whereas Torres giving the robot the ability to procreate is obviously going to have disastrous ramifications probably centuries down the line.
Yeah.
Now, maybe the last thing to talk about then before we move on to alliances, because I think that we're both excited to talk about alliances, is Data. I mean, he does get mentioned in this episode. It is I always forget if they mention him by name in this episode, but they do.
And they even make a point of he has a name, not a designation. But...
I mean, a number is a name. I don't have a real problem with that. I mean, robots are robots. But I don't know, how do you feel about the show? And we'll talk about Spock and alliances as well. But
I think they're two sides of the same coin, really. Star Trek has not any time that Star Trek has mentioned an earlier character, it's been a big thing. And I know Spock's appearance in Reunification, right? You did not like that. I liked it a little more than you, but you felt that it was a little unnecessary. It was kind of gimmicky. In both of these episodes, the mentions of Data and Spock seem gimmicky. Seem like it's trying too hard to connect Voyager into the Star Trek canon, and when I don't feel like it's been missing that. Do you know what I mean? Like, it feels a little pandery to me.
Yeah, well, you're going to enjoy an episode coming up soon.
Oh, boy.
I don't know. I kind of disagree with you, only because I would kind of more agree with you with the mention of Spock and alliances, which we'll talk about in a few minutes.
Yeah, that's
because
fair.
I don't know, her talking about Data to me, while it's a little on the nose, because I don't think the robot was really worried about the fact that B'Elanna Torres wasn't thinking that he was sentient or something, but it seems natural to talk about. I mean, they do only have one artificial life form in their society, and he would be very famous. And I think that...
And B'Elanna, especially as an engineer, would know him. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and so, I mean, I don't think it's anything more than that. I don't think that... I think that the lack of the mention would not have hurt the episode, but I think without mentioning Data by name, it would seem a little weird.
And to me, I guess it was more of a case that it was both episodes having a reference to an earlier series, and I feel like there was another one last week.
Well, Tom Paris in Non Sequitur did not mention Odo by name, but mention the grumpy constable or something like that. And so anybody that watches Deep Space Nine will know who that is.
Although, didn't they also talked about? I mean, since they were talking about an event from the pilot, which we did see, that wasn't as bad. I don't think that was really a problem. I mean, the show certainly has done that in the past, and I will say, I mean, to your point, I will say that or just say this as a point of observation, that Voyager seems very comfortable with mentioning the other characters from other Star Trek shows much more frequently than any other Star Trek show that we've seen so far has. And maybe that is just simply a function of it being in the Delta Quadrant, and we can't check in with a Klingon. We can't we can't have these nice world-building bits that we did. We can't really connect to the world we know, and so this is their way of doing that, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's right. Well, I lied. There's one other thing I want to mention briefly before we move on to alliances, which is the scene between Neelix and B'Elanna, which spearheads her entire solving of the problem. And the only thing I want to ask you about Neelix is, when do you think he's going to get his counselor's license?
Oh, I like Neelix as the Guinan of the show he's trying to be.
I think it works fine. He's got all these life lessons. He's lived a very different life than the rest of them. And, when you're up at 4 a.m. drinking bad coffee, Neelix is there to talk to you.
Good for Neelix. He has really been a very good morale officer.
I think you might want to call him Glee-nix.
No, I'm not going to do that. What is wrong with you? I hate the show Glee.
All right, let's talk about alliances, which is it's a hell of an episode.
I have to admit something. I cried a little at the end of this episode.
You cried?
I swear to God. Yeah, well, I happened to read...
I don't think the makeup looks that bad, Richard.
I read an article about Dickless Spencer and talking about, neo-Nazi movements in the U.S. now when Donald fucking Trump is president and all of that, and talking about these people as abandoning certain ideals of America, and whether or not America has always stuck by its ideals is another conversation for another day. But the speech at the end of this episode resonates very strongly in how far we've come from the original series, in which the Federation is very easily living by its principles, where Kirk is the representative of the Federation and, by extension, America and democracy and all of those good, great things. And I don't know, we are living in a very chaotic age and all of that, and it is extremely difficult to not want to cross one's own morality. And so, I don't know, just her speech at the end about, in a lawless place, we have to follow our values even more strongly, just touched me very much.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that I think on the one hand, this episode is incredibly heavy-handed, and I'm not sure that that's a problem.
Yeah, no,
I mean, we're watching this in a very particular time and place, and I sat down today to watch this episode. As we record this episode, we record ahead of time. Things are apparently spiraling out of control in the Trump administration, and we'll see what happens when this episode is released in a month or so, because who the hell knows, we might all be dead. But it is the case that I find solace in this, because yes, we've talked a lot about how Star Trek is all about people coming together in good faith effort, in a spirit of cooperation and friendship, and that's basically what Janeway says. That's how they operate, and we all know that because we've watched Star Trek all these years. But I don't know, something about it really works, and I think that it I think on the one sense it comes across as a little naive in this episode, and we can talk about that. But I also like the fact that Janeway is so committed to her principles.
I mean, I think it's fascinating that this is coming from, because when this episode was written, we're what, 94, 95?
95, yeah.
95. Politically, things are very different then as they are now, and yet this is... I mean, this is very much a message to now, I felt. And, I mean, it's one thing to say, we need to commit to our principles and law when things are going well, but when things are spiraling out of control into chaos is when this is actually important.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think that speaks to, I mean, one of the things that we've always said on this podcast in the 27 years that we've been doing it is that Star Trek has a way of staying relevant, even in episodes that were just random, weird episodes that were written in entirely different political, cultural, sociological contexts. You can still find something in it. And I think one of the journeys of this podcast has always been saying, okay, is Star Trek great art? Maybe not. But there is something very, very profound about it. And there is something very special about it.
Something very true about it?
Yeah, to some
degree. There is
a
truth and a wisdom to this.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think that you see that in this episode because...
Which is about white supremacy, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, come on. Literally, it is about white supremacy. Let's dispense with the trade first because I find them the least interesting part of the episode. Now... just as a point of backstory, so I think I mentioned to you and the listeners a while ago, I think maybe in Initiations, which was the second Kazon heavy episode, I think, that was the one with little Kazon Nog.
Yeah.
that the Kazon were designed to be analogs for gangs,
yes.
right? And you can see that in this episode very specifically. So Kenneth Biller, who wrote Initiations, apparently Michael Piller told him to go out and do research on gangs in LA, and he did it and wrote this document. And Jerry Taylor used that document to help her write this episode, because essentially what the Trabe represent and what the Kazon represent are white and black people in America. And
yeah,
I think that, I don't know that the show was necessarily aware of that, but I think it's very... Well, we can see that pretty easily these days.
Well, this is only a few years. Is this even 5 years removed from the LA riots? How long ago?
LA riots were 91.
Yeah, so this is about 4 years before. So still very much in people's minds. And so essentially what happened...
Also right around the same time that the O.J. Simpson stuff was going on, which was another analog for the different ways in which white and black people in America view the country.
What essentially happened between the Kazon and the Trabe is the equivalent of the LA riots swarm the entire planet, start similar riots in other places, and eventually drive the Trabe out of their home. And so you have this wonderful doublethink from the Trabe where these people were violent and we locked them up and we got what we deserved, but they're going to be violent again, so we have to destroy them. There is at once the understanding that they caused their own problems, that their treatment of the Kazon was what eventually got them to be desperate enough to fight for their own survival. And
yeah, because there's a lot of overlap between the two episodes this week, because that's something very similar to what happened with the aliens from Prototype, where they design these robots to fight their war for them, but they eventually turn on their masters. And so the same kind of not the same thing, but a similar thing happened with the Trabe and the Kazon.
Yeah, and we see Voyager Janeway is trying to be figure out the peaceful solution, because there's a feeling at this point between the Trabe and the Kazon, okay, everybody's suffered enough. Like, we don't need to do this, let's stand down. And yet the Trabe's refusal to believe that and be in good faith is, they are very much playing the victims even as they are instigating this problem.
Yeah, no, I think so, because, the Kazon are obviously skeptical of this, and rightly so, I think. There is a little bit of I don't know, I go back and forth in between this episode in saying that it's naive or not right, because, yes, on the one hand, you have Janeway giving a couple of very nice on-the-nose speeches about how wonderful the Federation is, and let's not forget our principles, and we approach aliens in good faith, and that usually works for us. There's that.
And the second she says that, oh God, the Trabe are going to come and be assholes.
Well, right. I mean, this is not, I would say that this is a sort of didactic episode, but I don't know that it works any less for that reason. Yeah. And that voiceover is they run under that images of the doctor helping all of the little Trabe children, get their malnutrition taken care of. So yes, obviously everything is great. But what the real sadness is of it, though, for me is the Trabe, if they had actually internalized the lessons that they should have learned, that they said they learned, right? Like, the Trabe are able to snow Janeway into believing that they have learned their lesson and now are basically, Federation light, that they want to go to the Kazon. They want to say, yes, we should not have done this to you. This was a mistake. We did not do it. We were all children when this happened, or not even born, but we apologize or whatever, right? Yeah. But then the other part of that is that Janeway's own goodwill and her own sense of approaching this negotiation, approaching the Trabe in good faith, in trusting them until proven otherwise, has pretty bad consequences. And I think that it's important to show the bad consequences sometimes.
Well, I think the hell of it is the Kazon, although they have several complicated motives, the only reason Seska is able to finally convince Hermage is, partially ego, you don't want to be the only one who doesn't show up, and also enticing him with, well, you'll be able to find out what their things are, but the Kazon are actually willing to negotiate. They may have a slim possibility. They may not get through this with everybody being happy, but all of them do show up, and none of them are sabotaging the meeting. And I think that's very significant. I mean, Janeway would obviously love to leave this region of space peacefully, right? She would love if everybody would be happy. If there is a legitimate way to negotiate peace between the Trabe and the Kazon, we see her trying to take it. I feel like the Kazon actually have a glimmer of being willing to listen to reason on this.
I think so too, because, you know, it kind of contextualizes what we've seen of the Kazon before, right? That they, in a sense, are not these sort of mindless, violent people that Janeway, or that other people make them out to be, not Janeway. And what I look at that and I say, okay, well, what's happening with the Kazon here is that they were basically abused for centuries, and they are now sowing their own oats or whatever. They only know how to deal with each other through the use of violence as well, which is something that, you know, abused people, that's how they interact with the world a lot of times, and they have to unlearn that sort of behavior. And
well, yeah, if they are placed into ghettos where there is even less things to, you know, even fewer resources, and so they are fighting among themselves, even in an expansive galaxy, it's habit, yeah.
Well, you're right. It's more than habit. It's sort of it's how they interact with the world. It's how their psyches have been shaped. And yes, of course, a lot of the Kazon that are now in charge did not live on the Trabe homeworld when they were under occupation by the Trabe, but it is the case that those kind of things would still be passed along to them culturally and socially.
But again, they are willing to at least sit down on the table, and if this ended with the Trabe saying, listen, just leave us in peace, Voyager's going to escort us out. Once we're out of your space and even further and we find a nice place, we're going to settle home, we'll never see each other again. I mean, these as you said, these Kazon, most of them did not grow up on the homeworld, and certainly in a generation, none of them will have grown up on the homeworld. And so, with the Trabe totally out of it, and at least they've all agreed on this one thing, that may be the first tiny step towards stability. Again, it's only been 30 years. It hasn't had time to settle into rules and stuff. In a generation, it might be a little more stabilized. They may find themselves into diplomatic entities.
I want to move away from the Kazon for a minute, though, and maybe we'll come back to them, maybe we won't, because the other part of this episode, we'll have to talk about Seska as well, but I think the other very important part of this episode that is kind of understated is this idea of, you know, what responsibilities does Janeway have to the rest of the crew? Is it enough to get them home without sacrificing Federation ideals? I mean, she very coldly tells the Maquis, who is upset at the death of his friend, from a series of Kazon attacks that probably has everyone on that ship on edge, that she would destroy the ship before she would let one piece of Federation technology get into the Kazon's hands. And I wonder about that, because we're supposed to sympathize with her, but at the same time, what are they trying to get home for if it's not to get home? I think that there's a question in my mind about, I don't know what right Janeway actually has to make this decision for all of them. If that guy was on a regular Starfleet vessel, tooling around the Alpha Quadrant, decided that this was not for him, resigned his commission and went off to live in San Francisco, he could do that. That would be fine. But Janeway is now telling him that he is under pain of death, and he doesn't want to be under pain of death. He wants to get home or not die. And I think that there's a fundamental problem with Janeway's approach.
Well, there's two things that I'm thinking of. Is number one, in the Alpha Quadrant, there would also be somebody to complain about Janeway's decisions too, right? If this guy, if somebody believed that legitimately Janeway was making poor decisions, she wasn't a good, there would be a structure in place for dealing with that kind of a thing. Especially in Starfleet, she would have accountability.
And there kind of is, because there is that bizarre idea in Star Trek that the Doctor can override the captain if he thinks she or he is compromised. Which, all right. But I see what you're saying.
But that's not the case here. Janeway isn't compromised if she just is making a decision, and she is making this decision with all of her faculties intact, and she's not being influenced, right? This is a legitimate decision from her point of view, but do you know what I mean?
No, because I see what you're saying, because I think that you're right, that in this kind of context, eventually there would need to be some sort of review board put in place or something. Yeah. That if they did decide to challenge the captain's decision, it would be such a massive, political thing that they would probably almost never do it. But they would have to do it sometimes.
Yeah, there would be a barrel trial kind of episode, right? But this is not, there is nobody to do that. And the other point is that while I think I may agree with Janeway's decision that the Kazon can't have our tech yet because they are not going to be using it responsibly, it will cause a war in the quadrant. And second, that guy does start dealing with the Kazon, right? He doesn't sell them any tech. He doesn't really give them any major information because the negotiation ends up happening before that, but he is communicating with them.
Just as a point of clarification, I don't know that the guy who is dealing with the Kazon is the same guy that challenged Janeway in the mess hall. I mean, all white men look alike, so I don't know, but...
Yeah, but in a way it doesn't matter, right? Because the point is made. People are going to disagree with Janeway's decision, and I mean, Seska's an extreme example of what happens when somebody questions one decision. Maybe nobody is going to go as far as Seska has, but people are still going to go behind Janeway's back if they feel that her authority is not for them.
Yeah, I mean, think about the number of times that someone challenged, Picard or God forbid, Sisko's.
Yeah.
Orders, and I can think of a few instances, but not many. And so far in the year and a half that Voyager has been on the air, we've had Chakotay, her first officer, Tuvok, her security officer and tactical chief, B'Elanna Torres, her chief engineer, Seska, who we'll let Seska slide because she was a secret Obsidian Order agent. And she's also got this Maquis guy now who is secretly going behind everyone's back and Janeway's back by the property of transitive property. I don't know that Janeway is understanding that her hardline approach to this is causing a lot of this to happen.
She doesn't. Yeah, this is one of those power isn't a real thing, right? It's an illusion. It's something that's done. It's a process in a way, and it's a process that is more easily renewed and wielded by Janeway in the Alpha Quadrant, but yeah, she doesn't quite realize the degree to which it is breaking down, the longer they are farther away, the more her power may fade.
Yeah, and also I just think it's interesting as well that the two characters in this episode, that Chakotay, who brings her the idea of the alliance with the Kazon, and Tuvok, who essentially talks her into it, have also violated her orders. Yeah,
and I think it's hilarious that the position that the thing that they propose is exactly what Seska was wanted to do in the first place. I mean, this is I can only imagine Seska's reaction when they first tell her this, because she must be thinking, well, you fucking kicked me off the ship. I had to leave, and now you want to do this. Okay, sure, but it is a mark of the fact that time has passed, frankly. The fact that they are reevaluating that decision. Now they, of course, at the end of the episode, come to decide, no, we were right in the first place. We shouldn't deal with the Kazon. But, again, the Kazon are dealing with them fairly at the end of the episode, at least enough to get to the table.
Yeah.
Well, that may change.
Yeah, that may change. And I also think the other thing to keep in mind as well is that, in State of Flux and then again in Maneuvers, the idea was that Seska was trying to get at their technology. And that is something that Janeway cannot abide. That is her hard line. Okay, that's fine. We're talking about, nuclear weapons, right? We don't want North Korea to have nuclear weapons, so we're not going to, that's our hard line, right? That makes sense to me. I understand that.
Yeah.
But Janeway going to the Kazon and saying, we will provide you what? Like, we will provide you our ship, we'll provide you help, medical supplies, food, et cetera, et cetera. What is in this for the Kazon? Like, I think that just as Janeway is being a little naive in believing that her power structure is going to stay in place, or the command structure is going to stay in place for the 70 years it's going to take them to get back to the Alpha Quadrant. I also think that Chakotay and Tuvok are being naive in thinking that the Kazon are going to go, oh, we're going to get penicillin and pizza? Great. We don't need your replicators or transporters or anything like that.
I would say the Seska answer to that is just, sure, let's do this very tiny alliance, and then we have our foot in the door. And maybe in 6 months, well, it would be really nice if we could have some food replicators on there, or just something that can make water. Nothing else. It just makes water. And then 6 months from then, well, maybe we could have food too. I feel like Seska would be influencing the Nistrum that, all right, Voyager's here, and they're our friends, and we just gotta play nice until they give us more stuff and they're more comfortable.
Yeah. I think, And I mean, the other thing too, of course, is that they are going to leave Kazon space eventually. I mean, the Kazon are not owners of the entire Delta Quadrant. So this is going to become a solved problem at some point. We just don't know when.
Yeah. I think they figure, for the Kazon, what they would really get is the opportunity to get more before they leave the space. But it is true. This is a very cited argument towards Voyager.
Yeah.
And Voyager kind of has to manipulate the Kazon that they are allying with to say, well, the three of us groups are stronger than the Nistrum. And, they're trying to play on the Kazon sense of this rivalry between the sects.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that the rivalry between the sects is one thing. I think that the Kazon are starting to be portrayed as a little bit more reasonable than we otherwise thought they were. And there's also fewer sects than I thought there were. There seem to be 5, so okay, that's fine. I guess the last thing I want to talk about before we wrap this episode up is the one thought that I have I keep going to in the Pale Moonlight, and that is such a outsized episode on the franchise that it seems churlish to compare this episode to that, and certainly the Pale Moonlight happened a few years down the road. In terms of where Deep Space Nine was at this point, and let's remember that Deep Space Nine was in the 3rd season, so in the early 3rd season of its show. Do you think that this interpretation of, or kind of criticism or examining of the Star Trek ideals in an episode like this is done well? It's certainly different than where Deep Space Nine goes.
Well, it's also, I would say it's very different from where Deep Space Nine was, just in terms of their... So, Season 3 is when we're beginning to see the Dominion. We're still dealing with the Cardassian stuff, and... I mean, frankly, the Trabe in a lot of ways reminded me of where Cardassia is at the end of Deep Space Nine, and I wonder if that's going to be if the Cardassians are going to eventually become the Trabe or not. But, I guess that's a side point. I would say, though, there were fewer challenges to the ideals of the Federation in DS9. We certainly had a lot of other perspectives, but the Cardassians were not an existential challenge to the Federation, at least not in the same sense that the Dominion became, right? They were certainly different. They certainly had different philosophies, but it was still a view of tolerance, openness, diversity versus dominance and, control and authority and all of those things. And so I would say the Kazon way of life, the Cardassian way of life, I think is a little more comprehensible to the Federation. The Kazon way of life so far does seem to be this constant war. First of all, war against the Trabe, which may have been justified, and then war against each other. And again, it's a lawlessness. It is a sense of nobody willing to deal. At least the Cardassians are willing to deal at times.
Yeah, yeah.
But again, I think where this is showing that in the right circumstances, the Kazon can and may want to negotiate and may understand the importance of negotiating, and that's a first step. This episode is a very important first step, I'd say.
Yeah, I think that's right, because what I keep coming back to is the idea of strategy versus tactics, right? And that also speaks to Chakotay's one of Chakotay's conversations in this episode with Janeway, where he essentially says, the Starfleet way is great, the Federation way is great, but that may only work. And he doesn't even say does only work. He kind of says may only work. It's a theory of his that their approach may only work in the Alpha Quadrant when you have the full force of the Federation, apparatus behind you. And when you are one ship alone in a distant part of the galaxy with absolutely no backup, they can't fly to Starbase 2 and get supplies. They can't go back to Earth. There's no backup. There's nothing. They are out there by themselves. That the overall strategy of which is kind of what I'm thinking of in terms of the Starfleet morality, which is approaching alien cultures in good faith, in believing to trust until and unless you are until proven otherwise.
Yeah.
That those are the strategies involved, and the tactics may have to change. The tactics in the Federation of we don't get involved in wars, we don't make alliances with other alien races, et cetera, et cetera. Those tactics may have to be different in the Alpha Quadrant. And I think the one failing of this episode is perhaps the end of the episode with Janeway's rousing speech about how maybe they were all right and she was how they were all wrong and she was right is a little bit too far for me, because I kind of think that Chakotay and Tuvok and the Maquis and everybody else have a point, and I think that they're going to continue to have this problem.
This is put it this way, we're probably, I assume the Kazon arc is the first kind of chunk that we're dealing with. We'll probably be dealing with them the rest of the season. I don't know if we'll be dealing with them next season, but at some point they're going to, as they say, they're going to leave Kazon space and deal with something else. And that, they may figure out the Kazon stuff. They may figure out how to get the Kazon to fairly deal with them, but they're eventually going to face things that will not fairly deal with them. Again, I know that eventually the Borg are going to show up, and the Borg don't negotiate.
Or do they?
Well, that's going to be the interesting challenge, isn't it? I guess just on a plot note, Seska is telling the Maj that it's his baby. And of course, this is just high soap opera drama.
There was a reason why Seska stuck out of my mind as a soap opera character, and I think it's this reason. So
now let's put it this way. If the Maj, who is extraordinarily misogynistic, who is very, not comfortable with taking orders from a woman and all of that. But so far, Seska has managed to hold her own around there, has managed to figure out how to make her suggestions and calm him down and all of those stuff. But she is in a very precarious and kind of dangerous position. And I'm your consort and I'm carrying another man's child, it's got to get her killed immediately. So certainly she has a lot of very strong motivations to lie.
Well, I will ask you a very deliberate question. Why do you believe Seska when she says it's Chakotay's child, and you don't believe her when she says it's the Maj's child?
No, I guess I guess where I'm taking in this is it's equally plausible, and it's also plausible it's Tuvok's kid or something.
It's also plausible that Seska took some of her own DNA and impregnated herself with it. We are talking about science fiction.
Yeah, and do we even know she is indeed pregnant at this point? Has that been confirmed? But assume she is.
She could just be eating a lot of stew. We don't know.
I don't know. No, she's telling Chakotay it's yours to mind fuck him, to create a bond between the two of them, to get herself an out if she decides that the Kazon ship is a little too hot for her, or is it legitimately his and she's lying to the Maj to protect herself, to keep her position, to solidify her position even more.
Yeah. Plot twist, it's actually Neelix's child.
Oh, no. Oh my God, poor Kes. After all of that, no, that would make the jealousy be really ironic, because after all this jealousy, he was the one who was playing around.
That Neelix.
I guess apropos of nothing, I really loved Janeway and Tuvok in his quarters. He's half smiling. He tilts his head when she's talking. He's practically ebullient in that scene.
Yeah.
And I love that because they're in his quarters. She is a good friend of his. They're, talking intimately. He's extremely relaxed, and it's really nice seeing Tuvok relaxed and at home. Again, I even going back as far as I'm thinking of Sarek and Amanda and how, his reactions to her. Again, it's nice seeing a relaxed Vulcan.
Yeah,
I guess.
I agree with all of that, and I think the little orchid speech is very nice, and his intimate knowledge of Janeway, knowing that she likes Vulcan spiced tea when she comes for their heart-to-hearts is very nice. I will just point out, though, that a relaxed Tuvok is still a Tuvok that is wearing his uniform.
Of course. He is a Vulcan.
Comfort is illogical.
This is comfort. It has been designed by the Federation for maximum breathability. It's moisture wicking. I mean, I'm sure that I know that the costumes, especially on early seasons of TNG, were very poorly made, but in the Federation, this is the best material that ever could possibly be.
I think that's very true. All right, well, I think that's it for this episode of the podcast. If you have any thoughts on either of the episodes we just talked about, Prototype or Alliances, please leave a comment on the post for this episode of the podcast at TrekAboutShow.com. You can check out our Patreon, patreon.com/TrekAboutShow, which also supports our other podcasts Tuning In. We are releasing our new podcast on the X-Files episodes Firewalker and Red Museum in 2 days on Thursday. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, we are there. Trek About Show is our username in all those places. And as always, please leave us an iTunes review for Trek About. It is the best way for new people to find the show. And the more stars we get, the more we feel great. Next week, we are going to be talking about the Star Trek Voyager episodes Threshold and Meld.